Good morning, 7th graders. This lesson is the beginning of chapter 10, if not all of it. A couple things that I want to do before we begin. I want to remind you about your chapter questions. I want to remind you that not only do you need to have complete sentences that start with a capital letter and end with a period, I am looking for you to have more than one sentence for most of these answers. Try to look at it similar to an ACE answer, although I'm not really looking for a full paragraph. I'm looking for you to restate an answer. I'm looking to see a cite for you to cite and give a text detail, and if possible, I would like you to explain. So I'm looking for these answers to be at least 2 to 3 sentences. However, some of these, as you get the information from the book, there's a paragraph worth of details that you can pull into that answer. And I'm saying this, my lessons are lagging a little bit in our communication, as I just finished grading chapters 1 and 2. Some of them were fantastic, but some of them could use some improvement. And even though we are not in school together, I do still expect you to put your best effort forward. So let's take a look at the questions for chapter 10. All right, so we see 6 questions, which lets us know this is a shorter chapter. 1, identify Joe Hooker. 2, what did Chad's letter to Jenny say? 3, what did Ed do when he rejoined the Army? 4, what were people's feelings about the battle at Gettysburg? 5, why did Jenny go to Washington? And 6, was Jenny's trip to Washington worthwhile? All right, so I'm standing near the map today because there are several important battles that we're going to come across right in the beginning of the chapter. So I want to make sure that I am nearby to our different displays here on the map. So the first one that we're going to reference, even before I begin to talk, is Chancellorsville. And we had reference to that just a little bit. We are going to be looking within the state of Virginia. Last time we were a little nervous about the fact that the Confederates were moving north and could take over these different places in Virginia, which is pretty much right near Washington, D.C. So there are 3 places that are frequently mentioned kind of together, that they're a very similar battle. One of those places is Fredericksburg, which is right here. And then Chancellorsville is actually just right below that. There are 3 places, all pretty close within each other in the time frame of the battle. So when we reference those, those are what we're looking at. But we're in mostly this area here of Virginia. So start with me. We are on page 148 in our book. In May of 1863, so now we're 2 years into the war, news came from the east of another Union disaster, this time at Chancellorsville. It was frightening news, for whatever one wished to believe, the very obvious fact was that a Union army with the advantage of greatly superior numbers had been terribly beaten by a Confederate army with the advantage of a greatly superior general. The contrast between Robert E. Lee and Joseph Hooker was not one to bring either pride or hope to the Union cause. So we'll pause there for just a second to talk about that. So the Union Army had more soldiers for this battle. You would think having numbers would be positive and they would be able to then win this battle, but that is not what happened. Robert E. Lee, heard that name from the beginning. He has been the top general for the Confederates pretty much the whole way through, and he is top-notch. And he has led his army to be able to defeat this army that even has more numbers. So we're introduced here to Joseph Hooker, and we're going to get a little more information about who he is. He is one of the Union generals. So let's read about him. The papers had carried stories and pictures of Joseph Hooker all during the winter of 62 to 63. He was a tall, handsome man with wavy blonde hair and the look of a daredevil in his eyes. He was a hard drinker and a hard fighter. Fighting Joe Hooker, he was called. An arrogant man, highly contemptuous of McClellan and Burnside, of the Confederate Army, and of the possibility of his own defeat. So he thinks very, very highly of himself, and contemptuous, meaning he does not like. He does not like McClellan, he does not like Burnside, and he does not believe that he will fail. He was a dashing, fighting, confident man, the papers had said, the kind of general the North so desperately needed. And so he replaced Ambrose Burnside as commander of the Army of the Potomac. So how many times have we had generals replaced? We know that Grant has been replaced. We know that McClellan was replaced with Ambrose Burnside. And now Ambrose Burnside has been replaced with with fighting Joe Hooker. So the Union just can't seem to find that top-notch general that's going to lead them to winning the war. I also want to point out that there were many sentences in there as far as who Joe Hooker is. The main thing we do need to know is that he has now taken over the Army of the Potomac. But describe for me what type of a man he is. So go through those details. He is arrogant. He thinks highly of himself. He's a hard drinker. You know, throw those details in, and you can separate them with commas. Make sure that you're doing your sentence structures correctly. Then there was Chancellorsville. So that's this place here. And I'm going to mention this before we read it, just because I'm pretty sure it's not in the book. It might be, but I don't remember. We actually didn't read this novel last year, so I'm a little out of sorts. But usually we have somebody in class researching either a person or a place. And before we read the chapter, we are presented with this information. Unfortunately, it's just not going to work out for us to do that this year. But one of the, usually someone will have researched Chancellorsville. And one of the neat details about Chancellorsville, I don't know if it's neat, it's kind of sad, but funny at the same point, is that Stonewall Jackson, now we don't have somebody who researched him this year. I believe he was for the Confederate Army. We haven't heard his name too much, but he got that nickname Stonewall because he stood his ground. In this particular battle, he was accidentally wounded, not killed. No, he was killed, I think. Oh my goodness, I'm losing my details here. So I guess it's not that funny. It's actually quite sad. He was, I'm remembering details now. He was a Confederate general, and there was an error in their fighting, and he was shot, I believe, and killed by his own men. So that's a detail in Chancellorsville. We'll see if we read it in the book. I don't think that we do. Sorry, I add so many extra details here and I confuse you. Okay, I'm going to pick up right at the bottom 148 because I'm not sure where I left off. So then there was Chancellorsville, where handsome Joe Hooker folded helplessly before Lee's onslaught, meaning that he kind of just gave up. And in the early summer of '63, papers that had expressed admiration for his spirit and confidence were screaming for his head. Do you think he's going to keep that top position now? But the fall of General Hooker was of little importance compared to the fact that 17,000 Union soldiers had gone either to their deaths or to a Confederate prison camp as a result of the Battle of Chancellorsville. So that's really the worst of it. Not so much that Joe Hooker fell, but that 17,000 in one battle, just from the Union side, either killed or now are prisoners of war. The same old fear haunted Jethro and his sister as they silently plowed the young corn during the weeks when more stories of the disaster came with each newspaper. Was Shadrach Yale one of the 17,000? But in late June, a letter came from Shadrach, a letter which reflected the deep gloom that hung over the Army of the Potomac and the anger felt not only by the common soldier, but by many of the generals for the kind of leadership fighting Joe Hooker had exhibited. So gloom, they don't feel good about him. There was awe, too, in Shadrach's realization that once more a freak chance had allowed him to come through alive. But there was no optimism in his hope for future battles. I have been through Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Chancellorsville, hurt only by the agony of others. But there will be more battles. And you must tell yourself sternly, Jenny, that your love for me is no more sacred than the loves for which thousands upon thousands of women are weeping today. I think it wrong that I write to you with hope and optimism for our future. I think I must prepare you for the possibility, no, the probability of heartbreak, meaning most likely he's not going to come home. When a man has looked upon such massive waste of life as I have witnessed in these 3 battles, the presumption to consider his own little personal dreams becomes a matter of supreme egotism. A letter from John was more cheerful. The Army of the Cumberland was on the march with General Rosecrans. For weeks they had been drilling, but now they were sure that action was about to begin. There was Confederate General Bragg in Tennessee. I'm not exactly sure where, but Tennessee's over here, who must face Old Rosie before the snows fell. Most of the letter, though, was not about armies or campaigns, but of home, of Jethro's letter from the president, of Eb's behavior. There were long paragraphs in which John wanted to know how Nancy was faring, if she was well, how much the little boys had grown, whether or not they remembered their pa. It was a good letter. Nancy read it to the family over and over again to Ellen, whose lips moved while she listened as if she were trying to memorize each word. Eb wrote to Jethro from Mississippi. So Eb is down in Mississippi over here. And actually, I'll show you where he is in just a minute. He was on a river called the Yazoo, not far from Vicksburg, digging ditches, chopping wood, and building bridges. So Vicksburg is right here, and that is actually going to be a pretty important battle place later on as well. And the Yazoo River, I don't know if you can see this, there's a little blue line within here, and there's actually a city called Yazoo right here as well. So that's where Eb is in Mississippi. And that sentence I just read answers your question, telling you what he's doing now that he's back in the Army. So he's digging ditches, chopping wood, and building bridges. The heat and dirt were bad, he said, and there was an added hardness to his life brought on by weeks of improper absence. But Eb accepted it with humility. So that what he's saying there is improper absence, that's when he had deserted. And because he's now gone back, that does make his time back there a little bit harder. Think about how these other soldiers who did not desert might treat him. And his description here. It's hard to have some fellers hate you for what you done, but the blame is mine, and I'll take what they say to me and do my job till it's all over, till I fall over. So I think he realizes it'd be much better here to have them picking on me and working hard than to have been caught and killed. Eb thought the Confederate General Pemberton up in Vicksburg was beginning to sweat, and that was fine, but the mosquitoes were awful, and lots of the boys were sick with malaria. The papers had much to say of the operation around Vicksburg. What was Grant doing down there? Editors wanted to know. Was he going to continue stumbling all around the country, hesitating, bumbling, waiting week after week when an army mired down in disease-infested marshes? The men who wrote for the newspapers that Jenny and Jethro read aloud at night did not believe the Confederate Pemberton was beginning to sweat. Vicksburg, perched high on the bluffs of the Mississippi, had a natural fortification that Grant, with his inept stupidity, I believe inept is going to be one of our vocabulary words, but it's kind of that inability, and that they're calling him stupid, could not successfully storm any sooner than Joe Hooker could overtake Robert E. Lee. So I want to mention the bluffs that are up high. If you ever heard that in a battle, and we talked about that in one of the other battles, that because they're up higher, they have the advantage. So if you remember that one battle where Ambrose Burnside kept sending the boys up the ridge, they were at a disadvantage because they couldn't really shoot up and over the ridge, and they were being shot down upon. The bluffs are a very similar situation. So they're like, I don't think Pemberton's sweating. He's got the advantage. It was known that the president was being besieged to get rid of Grant. So they want him to get rid of him. After all, wasn't it true that it was not Grant who had been the victor at Fort Henry, but Admiral Foote and his ironclads? And on second thought, white-haired old C.F. Smith had actually been the brain behind the victory at Donelson. Nobody could deny that Grant had waited too long and had been surprised at Pittsburgh Landing. And certainly he had been driven back to Oxford, Mississippi. And in all these stories came the vague charges of drunkenness on the part of the discredited general. The stories were never verified, meaning they're never found to be true, but they occurred often enough to arouse deep anger in the minds of people whose sons had died under Grant's command. Ellen and Matt felt that anger. For many months, neither Jethro nor Jenny ever mentioned Grant before their parents. Despite the pressures, though, the president did not remove General Grant, but Joseph Hooker was removed. Another one of the president's generals acknowledged as a failure in the command of the Army of the Potomac. So that one particular unit, the Army of the Potomac, can't seem to find the right leader. Now, a new man came more fully into the public eye, George Gordon Meade. The men who came of a Sunday afternoon to talk of the war with Matt wondered how long this new general would last. The news, however, that overshadowed everything else during that June was the activity of Robert E. Lee, so the lead general for the Confederates. He had turned away from Richmond. So Richmond is in Virginia, and he's starting to go away from there. And for the first time during the war, a Confederate army, I pointed the wrong way, and I knew this too, was penetrating into the north. He is going up into Pennsylvania, into Shadrach's home state of Pennsylvania. So they've won in here, and now they're heading north. Could be towards Philadelphia, they're going to mention. We'll see. There were many speculations if Lee should take the cities of Harrisburg and Philadelphia. Might he not go on to Baltimore and then to Washington? Did Lee plan to let Richmond fall and in its stead to seize Washington? Wouldn't the exchange of capitals be worth his while? And weren't the chances for his success a good deal more than fair? This man Lee had become a legend, a fearful one for the North. Would it ever be possible to beat him? The results, some had been a draw, but were they ever a real defeat? The new General Meade had never had the experience of planning a campaign or of handling a huge army drawn up in battle. Robert E. Lee had little to fear as he maneuvered into the Army of Pennsylvania. They're suspicious, so the Confederate capital is in Virginia, and he's leaving there to go up into Pennsylvania, which is closer to Washington, D.C., and they're thinking, is he going to let the Confederate capital fall so that he can take over the other capital? Then that'll be an interesting battle. Out of the gloom of these predictions came the news during early July of Gettysburg, a spot of ground in Pennsylvania that Jethro had never heard of before. I'm actually going to stop there. Usually I would finish a paragraph, but because it started a new idea, I am going to save that for tomorrow's lesson, and we have hit our 20-minute mark. So just really quick, let's peek at which questions we have had a chance to answer. And if you would wrap those up. So we did identify Joe Hooker. We know what Shad's letter to Jenny said. It's probable he's not going to make it. Don't hold out hope for me. What did Ed do when he rejoined the Army? And we don't have the answers for 4, 5, and 6. So we're about halfway through chapter 10. You have the answers for the first 3 questions, and I will see you tomorrow.